I want to welcome everybody today to the June 8th edition of Noisy Reality. We're going to be talking with Prit Buttar, who is a prolific historian on the Eastern Front in the First World War and Second World War. And I just wanted to go through some preliminaries of his work, and also for our general audience that will look at this, I wanted to make some comments about the global war in the summer of 1944. We get to the back and forth with Prit. Prit is a doctor. He studied medicine at Oxford and went to the University of London before joining the British Army as a doctor. And he served on active duty with the Royal Irish Rangers and the Royal Green Jackets. He left the Army and worked first as a general practitioner and then worked in the National Health Service, which of course we as Americans would love to have. And he is involved in medical politics, both at the local and national level. And he's appeared talking about medical issues, which frankly would be very interesting for us to listen to on a different occasion. But he began to work on this issue of the Eastern Front with a book, and this is an amazing story because I really want to hear more about this, Battleground Prussia, which was inspired by one of his patients. And you can, of course, correct me, Prit, on this. She told stories about her life as a nurse in East Prussia and her escape from the Red Army near the end of World War II. And he spent, is this accurate, 8 years writing this book?
More or less, yes.
Wow. And here, for all of us, this is sort of the order of the books that he's done, because a lot of us have read his books over the years, and we're very grateful to Prit for putting the energy into writing about the Eastern Front in the First World War and also the Second World War, because you're dealing here, Prit, with students, serious students of both those issues. We've been doing things about this subject for 40 years here in New York City. So it's really great to hear and see another kindred soul. But these are some of the works he's done, which we recommend. This is when he starts to do this focusing of his attention on the Eastern Front in World War I, collision of empires in Germany ascendant. Then he finished it with Russia's Last Gap and the Splintered Empires, which are absolutely essential reading to understand the breakdown of Tsarist Russia and what led to the Russian Revolution. Then he shifted gears and began to work on the Eastern Front in World War II. And he did A Knife's Edge, Retribution, and then he worked on, because of course when you're writing about the Eastern Front, essentially you're writing about the southern part of the Eastern Front, if you're concentrating in these operational histories, the Reckoning, the defeat of Army Group South, Meat Grinder, these books on what happened in Lithuania, the Holocaust in Lithuania, To Be Siege is sitting on the siege of Leningrad, and then Hero City, and this most recent book here on Operation Bagration. He's working on a new book on the Red Army's advance to the Oder. Now, I just wanted to, for our general audience who has seen this, to just situate what we're going to talk about today in the wider context of the global war. We're talking about events in the summer of 1944. We're talking about events that are going on that have an interrelationship with each other. I sort of learned a lot when years ago when Gerhard Weinberg published his global history of World War II. It was done with tremendous attention to the interrelationship of the theaters of operation. And of course, this is happening in conjunction with what's going on in Asia, the Eastern Front, and throughout Europe. So at the same time, just before the D-Day landing, we have the breakout from the Anzio beachhead and the collapse of the defenses in Italy. Here's pictures of the liberation of Rome. Mark Clark is riding in the Jeep next to there. Then you have the question of D-Day, which most Americans will look on as one of the great events, or the only one of three events that they tend to associate with World War II. Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and the dropping of the bomb. But we're dealing here with a group of people who are basically military historians, so we have a different approach. This, of course, is landing on the British beaches on D-Day. This is Robert Capa's famous photograph of Omaha Beach. And here is a wider shot showing the strategic situation in the Western European theater. Operations developing in early June, leading to the breakout and 30th June. And this is several days after what we're going to talk about in greater depth. Here, of course, is the Normandy beachhead. just weeks before the breakout. Now, at the same time in Asia, there is a simultaneous series of operations happening. And one of the things I want to highlight first is something a lot of Americans don't pay attention to, and that is Operation Ichigo in China, which was an intentional attempt by the Japanese to basically knock the Chinese out of the war. Initially, as you can see here, their focus of these different operations was to remove the B-29 bomber threat that was at that beginning to operate against Japan. But strategically, their objective would be to topple the nationalist Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. And there's absolutely no doubt that these consequences of Ichigo had a dramatic effect on what occurs next in China. So here you have Ichigo Kogo, the first operation launched in April, and here you have Ichigo Togo 1, launched in the summer of 1944. And here, of course, is the overall effect of Operation Ichigo in the Chinese theater of operations. Then, of course, you have what's going on in Malaya. In Malaya, there's a constant back and forth. These are maps, of course, derived from the West Point atlases. And you have at this point the offensive operations that will eventually lead to the, quote, liberation of Malaya and Burma, etc. Now, the Central Pacific is marked by the campaigns that are happening at the same time. That in case here you see the campaigns of MacArthur through New Guinea, and in the Central Pacific you have the Marianas campaign that's more or less happening at the same time as these operations are. And here, of course, is the importance of the landing at Saipan, which will then allow them to strategically bomb Japan. And you have here the actual pictures of the fighting in the Marianas. But of course, the most significant thing is the Battle of Philippine Sea, which basically decisively defeats the Japanese carrier force. And then we turn to what we're going to talk about today, which is Operation Bagration. And we have, of course, pictures of it. This, of course, is, and again, this falls off the radar screen of many people who look at the war in its totality at that period of time. But as we'll hear from Prit today, the importance of it is quite astounding. And these are shots, of course. This is a famous shot of the prisoners being marched through Moscow. This is the liberation of Minsk. And then, of course, you have this overall map here of Operation Bagration, which shows how utterly game-changing it was in terms of all these other operations occurring simultaneously. So here today to talk about this is Prit Buttar, and we're really pleased to have Prit. It's been much too overdue for us to have a discussion about this. And Prit, how'd you, I talked about the Lithuanian nurse, but tell us how'd you got interested in this whole subject?
Well, you can imagine with a personal background in the army, military history was always one of my things. Um, I remember as a 16-year-old taking a copy of Alan Clark's book Barbarossa out of the public library. It was my first introduction to this colossal theatre of action. First time I had come across places like Stalingrad and Kursk. And it's interesting because that book, written in the early 1960s, in many ways shaped the areas that English language accounts would focus on the Eastern Front for the following few decades. Because he very much skipped over Bagration, it barely got a mention until I think Paul Adair then wrote Hitler's Greatest Defeat in, I think, the late 1980s or early 90s. And that was the first time that anybody had really addressed this battle in English. And it's a good example of how the first person to explore an area will often set the tone and the areas that other people will focus on. The scale of the conflict on the Eastern Front, though, is absolutely colossal. Um, the the context you've given is excellent, and it is just staggering to think of the scale of the Second World War at that time, ranging from the Pacific and Burma and Malaya all the way through Italy and France, and then this titanic struggle on the Eastern Front. In late 1943, Hitler, faced by a very poor set of options had decided the, if you like, the least bad. It's hard to describe this as the best option. The least bad option is probably most accurate, was to concentrate as much resource as possible in northern France in anticipation of an Allied landing, whilst leaving the minimum forces required on the Eastern Front to hold the Red Army at bay. The intention was to defeat the Allied invasion of Europe, to resume the U-boat war to prevent the United States from then reinforcing its troops in Britain, and then to turn Eastern strength to defeat the Red Army. But the minimum strength required to hold off the Eastern Front, whilst the Western Front was given priority, amounts to over 70% of Germany's military resources, which gives you an idea of just the sheer scale of this conflict. And Bagration, I think, has really never received the attention it deserves. 22 German divisions get destroyed in this operation. Others are badly weakened. Um, and all of this, of course, like the Battle of Normandy, is unfolding at the same time as another event, which is of absolutely critical importance for the closing months of the war, which is the failure of the July plot to kill Adolf Hitler, and the way that it destroys what little trust remains between Hitler and the senior officers within the army, and the consequences that has for the closing months of the war.
Mm. Yeah, very, very good points. And one thing you do in your book is get into the July 20th plot in great detail. But you raised the question of Alan Clark and how that, the book. I also read that book many years ago, and it sparked, of course, sparked my interest. I mean, United States, we're reading a lot of what you guys are reading in the UK, and some of the accounts we're reading are these personal accounts. Years ago, I met the person who was in charge of Ballantine Books, who himself was a veteran of the CBI. And he talked about, I said, well, why'd you publish all these memoirs? And he said, well, and like sort of Panzer Leader by Guderian and all these kind of books, the abridged version of that. And he said, look, people want to read about what happened, what they experienced. And you had, of course, probably the most well-financed book in military history after World War II, and that's The Longest Day. Because basically Reader's Digest subsidizes Cornelius Ryan and produces, a very powerful account of the actual landing of D-Day. But I think that's what it sets the tone as to how people are looking at the war. And then, of course, the 60s and the combination of that with the celebration of the First World War obliterated a consciousness of trying to understand what happened to the Eastern Front. And certainly anti-communism did too. And so if you fast forward through that period to someone like John Erickson, who also to me was quite influential,
Yes.
and reading. And Erickson, of course, writes a very amusing memoir of going to Moscow with Cornelius Ryan and having this, experience of Ryan being basically like extremely anti-communist writer, but they had a hard time dealing with the Soviets at the time, and the amount of information available about these kind of operations was not that voluminous. But that is a very important point, the historiography of it. So why don't you, I was sort of, if you could get into that a little more, because, I've looked through the book, I've read lots of books about both myself and Alex and others here. I've read a lot of this literature, and I've worked with people who are Russian speakers too, and German speakers. I once met Lieutenant General Niepold, who you refer to at a conference in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in 1987. And I didn't realize that he was, who he was until that book he did later of his memoirs as a staff officer in the Panzer Division. But again, the writing of this, in a general sense, it sort of permeates. You're looking at the Eastern Front, which a lot of people don't pay attention to.
It's a really important point that, yeah, I think I mentioned in The Reckoning that there is this cliche that history is written by the victors. One of the problems of the Eastern Front is that the English language history of the Eastern Front was largely written by the losers. By the time these memoirs started to appear, late 1940s into the 1950s, the Soviets were now the new enemy. Also, Soviet historiography was so distorting of the accounts that people really regarded with a great deal of skepticism. So the German memoirs were accepted at face value, and really without question. And it's really relatively recently, I'd say over the last 25, 30 years, I think David Glantz, to a degree, John Erickson were the first who really started challenging some of the German narrative
Mm.
and saying, this is very one-sided. So, for example, many of your audience here will be familiar with Manstein's book, Lost Victories.
Mm.
Um, it's worth noting that plus Guderian's book, Panzerlieder, many of the discussions that are recorded there between the author and Adolf Hitler are private conversations where there are only two people present. And one of those ends up dead in Berlin in 1945. So, we don't really know whether Manstein was as robust with Hitler as he claims he was. Likewise with Guderian's, but both of them, um, to to be kind, glossed over some of the atrocities their units were involved in. Um, to be less kind, both of them lied outright about their own personal level of involvement and responsibility. And this helped create this mythology that still persists today about the clean Wehrmacht and even extending to the SS. Paul Hauser wrote Soldaten wie andere aus, soldiers like any others. They weren't. Every unit in the Wehrmacht, certainly every in the SS, was involved in the most terrible crimes. And it's worth bearing in mind, as Waitman Bjorn, an American is based here in northern Britain and does Holocaust studies in northern England. He wrote in one of his books that you have to get this the right way around. The Holocaust that unfolded across the western parts of the Soviet Union was not the consequence of Barbarossa. Barbarossa took place in order to carry out that mass killing, and every part of the German war machine was complicit in that. And this was all completely ignored in those early accounts, which were largely accepted. When you read them, even Gert Niepold's account of the battle for Belarus, um, he records how we were beaten, we were driven back. It was really quite a shock to realize how effectively the Red Army had copied our tactics. If you like, the praise for the enemy is really, really grudging, and there's almost no recognition of the enormous progress the Red Army has made from its catastrophic and near fatal start to the war. Learning in the most impossible circumstances, when you're literally fighting for your very existence, you have a dictator who is still inclined to execute any of his generals who don't do as they're told. You have an enemy who's busy exterminating your population. And you've got to learn how to fight a mechanized war when you've gone into the war with completely the wrong doctrine, the wrong equipment, the wrong force balance. And the Red Army was just very much a work in progress. As I've said on other occasions, it's worth bearing in mind that right the way through to the end, um, the Red Army remains a blunt instrument. It isn't a rapier. It isn't a sharp-edged sword. At best, it's a very effective cudgel. Now, they get better at swinging that cudgel. The cudgel itself improves, but it's never the cutting-edge weapon that the German army is or that the Western armies are. But they make the best of it. They learn how to use it to maximum effect. And the historiography, certainly until I think David Glantz, really largely overlooked this and didn't really give the credit that was due. In a way, that also then misses another point, which is how rapidly the Soviet Union forgot those lessons in the years after the war. And, we only have to look at the performance of the Russian army in the Caucasus over the last 25 years and now in Ukraine to see just what a vast step back it has been. And they're not alone in this. Um, Robert Lyman has recently written a book entitled A Victory into Defeat about the evolution of the British Army from 1918 to 1939, where it went from being a war-winning army to an army that was actually hopelessly outclassed. So they're not alone in this. And it's a good example of how, you know, You can learn how to do things in difficult circumstances, but once those circumstances ease, there is a tendency to sink back into your previous patterns of thought and behavior. And that was certainly the case with the Soviet Union and now the modern Russian army.
Yeah, very good points. And of course, you look at what happens after the war when Franz Halder is essentially put in charge of the whole operation to sit there and process the lessons of the German officers, which, and of course, B.H. Little Hart sort of gets misled. They actually have on recording Halder talking about misleading Hart. And that sort of sets the stage for these kind of things. And with David, of course, David essentially was subsidized as an army officer to do this amazing research, which he did. And many of us remember the first time. I remember the first time I heard David in 1984, which completely blew my mind because we had never seen that level of detail on the presentation of the Eastern Front from the Soviet point of view. And then we brought him here to New York as often as we could. So we've learned a lot from him. Now, I wanted you to just get into you're setting the stage for this operation in the spring of 1944. Because again, you talk in your preamble to the book about the general strategic back and forth, the Second Front issue, Stalin, of course. We have people, there's someone who isn't here today, but who has argued that we should have landed in 1942 in Europe. And we've had fun arguing about that. But give us a sense of how you see that. How do you see them preparing for this operation? Why did they choose that area to knock out Army Group Center?
This is a colossal front line. It really is a huge, huge theatre. The eventual start line for Bagration for an American audience is the equivalent of a start line running from New York City to Richmond, Virginia. And that's only it's barely a third of the Eastern Front. So there are huge territories here for them to choose. They have spent much of 1943 after defeating the Germans at Kursk, driving the Germans out of Ukraine, and have pushed them right the way back towards the Romanian border. There is an option there to continue that drive, but much like the original phase of Barbarossa, there is a disadvantage in this. So when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the front line expanded at a very dramatic rate because the coastlines diverge in the Baltic and so the Black Sea coast effectively runs east-west, but the Baltic coast is running almost due north. So as you advance east, your frontage is expanding enormously. So in 1944, the Red Army thinks if we now start pushing into the Balkans, that we're now moving away from the Black Sea coast, and our southern front line is just going to get longer and longer. So that's a disadvantage. There's also a question of, are there any war-winning objectives within reach? And it's certainly arguable that a strike to take out the Romanian oil fields would have been a very, very serious blow for the Germans. It would also have, as was proved at the end of 1944, entering this region utterly destabilizes the Axis because first Romania, then Bulgaria fall out of the German out of their alliance with Germany. Hungary thinks about it, but Hitler intervenes and prevents that. So yeah, there were options on the south, but the terrain wasn't favorable for this. Even if they had attempted to penetrate towards the Romanian oil fields, the Germans would have been able to pull back towards the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. And, forcing them out of that would have been a very, very costly business. These were the scenes of the most bitter fighting of the Eastern Front in the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of men died there. And if the Red Army had attempted to push the Germans into the Carpathians and then turn south into Romania proper, they would have left this exposed flank for the Germans to counterattack into. And by now, the Red Army knows just how effectively the Germans can counterattack. In the north, they have they have options that they're already driving the Germans back from Leningrad. They can penetrate into the Baltic states. But again, is this a war-winning option? Does it actually bring the end of the war much closer? The real options are in the central region. And for those of your audience who perhaps are less familiar with the geography here, the critical region here is the Pripyat marshes in the central part of the Eastern Front. And historically, these have always divided the Imperial Russian and the Soviet frontier into two. You can go north of the marshes or you can go south of the marshes, but they basically dislocate the entire Eastern Front. There is an option to strike west to the south of the marshes, which would carry the Red Army into what is now southeast Poland. From there, once they reach the Vistula, they could conceivably turn north, follow the Vistula all the way to the Black Sea, which would cut off Army Group North and Army Group Centre. It is a daring operation. It has great scope. It would probably win the war. It also would be extremely vulnerable to German counterattacks against both flanks, both by Army Group Centre and by reinforcements coming in from the west. So they then think, okay, so if we attack north of the Pripyat marshes, what are the options here? And through the consequence of the previous campaigns of 1943 and early 44, the Germans are occupying this enormous bulge that faces to the east, which basically just invites concentric attacks. So for the Red Army, there is this great attraction that they'll be able to mount an operation in this region on converging axes, which allows them to keep high troop concentrations even in the face of heavy casualties. It's arguable that this is unlikely to be a war-winning operation, but it's an operation that can inflict enormous damage upon the Germans. And of course, it is astride the most direct route to Berlin, which is of enormous value to the Soviets, because Stalin's already looking now towards the end of the war. And although he has, by the time the Tehran conference is finished, Roosevelt and to a lesser extent Churchill have largely accepted that Eastern Europe is going to be a Soviet sphere of influence. Well, Stalin wants to make sure of this by ensuring that the Red Army is in possession of as much of this territory as possible so there can be no argument. And pushing all the way to the Vistula and reaching Warsaw in 1944 will put him in a great position, not only to end the war in 45, but actually to control all of that territory that he wishes to control.
Now, one of the things that's interesting in this operation is the question of Maskirovka, the strategic deception that the Soviets are able to pull off. And I've often wondered, because of course we're familiar, and thanks to Professor Hensley with his brilliant multi-volume history of British intelligence in the Second World War, which the Americans did not do. We've not done something of that scale. We have a pretty good sense about the ebb and flow of the code breaking and how it influences operations. But the big mystery is the Soviet Union. And again, what are your thoughts about that? The issue of deception, how important that is, and also your thoughts about the evolution of the Soviet armor force at this particular time, which is force multiplied by Lend-Lease with the trucks, etc. What are your thoughts on those questions?
Very important questions. I think there are, on the intelligence and Maskirovka side, there are some fortunate synergies that work in favor of the Soviets. German intelligence on the Eastern Front in particular has always been, by Western standards, astonishingly amateur. At this stage, the section of the German military that's responsible for intelligence on the Eastern Front, Fremde Heere Ost, is headed by Reinhard Gehlen. His predecessor, Kinzel, was the man who came up with the largely fictitious estimates of the eventual size of the Red Army that led Hitler to believe that Barbarossa could be successful. And these were based on little more than educated guesses. Galen is now operating with even greater disadvantages because whereas Kinzel could rely on peacetime military attaches, commercial travelers, etc., now that the war is going, Galen has lost all of those. He has no agent sources in the East. Most of the German military intelligence is heavily infiltrated by the Soviet Union. And at this stage, although the Luftwaffe is still carrying out extensive aerial reconnaissance, Soviet fighters are now far more effective at keeping this at bay. So his options are very limited, and he doesn't really have very good intelligence on what's going on. Nevertheless, he writes the most wonderfully ambiguous reports for consumption at a higher level. So he will write reports which can basically mean anything you want them to mean. Um, and he will write things like, I don't really expect the Red Army to launch a major strategic offensive in this sector. However, it should be borne in mind that the fronts in this sector do possess substantial reserves, so they could still mount a major attack. What on earth does that mean? It can mean whatever you like. The the Germans have decided by this stage that actually the next Soviet effort is going to fall south of the Pripyat marshes and is going to strike through what is now Lviv and head for the middle Vistula. Um, as it happens, the Soviets aren't really, they have some awareness that this is what the Germans believe, but they've actually already decided that they're going to encourage the Germans to believe that that's where their attack is going to be. So we're now in the business of, people hearing what they want to hear. So there are train movements into that area. Troops are brought in and then quietly moved out at night and brought in again the following day to give the impression of a massive build-up in this area. Although they can't hide the build-up north of the Pripyat marshes, the Germans are encouraged to believe this is actually deception, whereas actually it's the real offensive. So there is, if you like, a fortunate synergy that the Germans guessed wrong and happened to guess, or their guess was that the attack would fall south of the marshes, which is exactly what the Soviets wanted them to believe. So you end up with this um, growing belief that that's where the operation is going to be. So by the time you get to summer 44, Army Group Center has lost most of its armor. Most of the panzer divisions have been shuffled off south in anticipation of this is where the hammer is going to fall. Meanwhile, the Soviet armored formations have undergone an enormous transformation from those early days. At the start of the war, um, most Soviet armored formations consisted of a mix of different types of tank. So they had reconnaissance elements made up with light tanks. They had a mixture of they had some T-34s, but they were still in a minority. They had these huge fleets of the pre-war light armor, which proved to be pretty useless, not least because of shortages of spare parts. Um, and then they had their heavy tanks, the KV-1s and KV-2s, which were pretty difficult for the Germans to kill, but they also destroyed roads and railway bridges and pretty much every other bridge they passed over, rendering logistics supply almost impossible in their wake. They were also, interestingly, KV-1s were hated by their crews. The drivers usually carried a hammer with them because the gear shift was so heavy that you had to whack it with a hammer with both hands in order to change gear. They also didn't have radios. And although this has been a source of much mockery that they intended to communicate by waving flags out of turret hatches during the battle, it should be remembered that in 1939 that was also British policy, and that many British tanks didn't have radios either. And it was only the reality of the war that made people realize that this was just no way to conduct operations in the middle of an armored battle. The last thing you're doing is looking out of the turret to see who's waving what colored flag and in which direction. Um, so they have changed their force structure by 1944. The armored formations have largely become much smaller and more homogeneous. So you will get a brigade that consists of T-34s, or that will consist of Lend-Lease Shermans or Canadian-built Valentines or whatever. The heavy tanks are now concentrated into heavy tank regiments. By this stage, certainly in the central sector, the old KVs are being replaced by the newer Joseph Stalins. And these are being used specifically as breakthrough tanks. Their purpose is to provide close support to the infantry, who are also heavily supported by, absolute fleets of assault guns, self-propelled guns, which will provide the infantry with close support to smash German defenses. Um, the tanks will be held back as much as possible to act as exploitation forces. And until this stage, one of the big flaws of the Red Army has been that although they've always intended to hold back large fleets of armor for exploitation, right the way through to the Cherkasy battles of very early 1944, the initial breakthrough doesn't succeed, and they have to start committing their exploitation forces in order to achieve the breakthrough, which means the exploitation forces are then weakened. Uh, but this time around, they have made sure that there are these breakthrough regiments of heavy tanks. There's a lot of self-propelled artillery supporting the infantry. The infantry has been coached massively on working closely with these. And one thing that the Red Army has been very good at is analyzing pretty much every operation as soon as it ends, and then writing a detailed staff report on what worked and most importantly, what didn't work. The tragedy to date has been that those reports say exactly the same every time. The artillery bombardment may have been heavy, but it was ineffective. There was very, very poor inter-arms cooperation between artillery, infantry, and armor. Air support was almost non-existent by Western and by German standards. It consisted of aircraft carrying out preconceived strikes, and there was no response to ground units running into trouble. So likewise, artillery couldn't switch its fire to support very effectively, and logistic support never kept up. So by the time Bagration comes around, these reports have been gone through again and again and again, and this time there is a hope that maybe this time some lessons have been learned, and as it turns out, they have been. And this is the important thing that you touched on earlier, which is the impact of Lend-Lease. And anyone who has served in the military knows that a tank is only as good as its logistic tail. If you can't keep it supplied with fuel and ammunition, it's basically a pillbox. It's not going anywhere. And the Soviets, all the way through the war, are increasing the engineering support for their armored formations. They've realized something the Germans learned at a very early stage, which is that you lose at least as many tanks to breakdowns and to terrain difficulties as you do to enemy action. So recovering these vehicles quickly can sustain your armored effort for a much longer period than simply throwing more tanks into the action, because all of those tanks need crews, they need ammunition, they need fuel. And the enormous fleets of trucks that the United States, that Canada and Britain have provided for the Red Army, together with very substantial amounts of fuel flowing across the Pacific and also up from Iran into the Soviet Union, means that for the first time they actually have stockpiled enormous amounts of fuel and ammunition behind the front line, so that they will be able to sustain this operation. This whole concept of deep battle is something that the Soviets have been thinking about since the 1920s, but this is the first time they actually succeed in carrying it out. And part of this has been learning that, once you start talking about deep battle, the deeper you go, the more important logistics become. And this is something that the Tsar's armies, the Red Army, until this stage, and indeed the modern Russian army, just have neglected and have never really paid attention to. But during Bagration and the operations that follow up to Berlin, they finally get this right, only to forget about it as soon as peace comes.
Yeah, no, the flow of operations. And by the way, for those of you, we're talking with Prit Buttar, who's the author of this book, Bagration, 1944. The flow of operations is detailed in great abundance in your book. But in synopsis, how do you see this? Because it's amazing how rapidly the Soviets break through, encircle these forces, and have this running battle that goes all the way to Warsaw. So, in a nutshell, how do you see that? Because, of course, we encourage people to buy the book and read it, which gives a greater detail of what they're doing here. But how do you see that from a broader perspective at this point?
Sure. I think I'd divide this into three phases. So the first phase is the breakthrough battle. And Hitler is insisting on rigid defense. pretty much every general is saying we're rather good at mobile defense, and that would be a good idea. We've got space to trade, and we can really do this. But Hitler insists he has this line of fortress cities that must be held at all costs. Um, During the fighting of 1942, the Red Army lost hundreds of thousands of men attempting to break the German defenses around the Rzhev salient. And eventually in 1943, Model conducted an exemplary withdrawal from that salient prior to Kursk. It was only when the Red Army moved through the German positions that they truly understood how complex and how deep the German defenses were. So by the time they get to Bagration, they actually, for the first time, really have a good understanding of the task that lies ahead. And they've actually thought in detail of how they're going to do this. And there are accounts of, down to battalion and company level, commanders being told it's the first 5 to 10 kilometers that matter. Once we get past those, life gets a lot easier, but they're going to fight like hell during that first phase. Also, it's a point I've repeatedly made in podcasts and in my books is that in many respects, the German infantry never recovered from 1941. The establishment strength of a German infantry division included thousands of horses. Um, and these horses were vital not only for reconnaissance, but also for pulling a lot of their heavy equipment. So even though if you have a full strength division with its full complement of artillery, etc., much of that artillery is relatively immobile. And even if they have motorized vehicles to tow the artillery, that's very dependent on having sufficient fuel to move the artillery. So the Red Army has learned that if you can push the Germans out of their defenses, and particularly if you can get to their gun line, after that, the fighting power of those infantry divisions declines very, very rapidly. So there is this first phase of breaking through that crust. And the Red Army does this through a variety of means. They do it by taking advantage of the alignment of the front line, things like the ridiculous salient around Vitebsk, which almost invites being pinched off. They rely on the southern part of Bagration by choosing to advance through some densely forested and swampy terrain where the Germans don't really expect them to be able to attack, but they've put in major sapper support to allow this to take place. And then elsewhere, they just rely on brute force. They rely on massive artillery fire, careful reconnaissance to maximize the value of that, and then just bludgeoning their way through the German lines. Once they've broken that line, there comes a second phase, which is this pursuit phase. These German divisions reeling back, trying to escape with varying degrees of success and failure. And the Soviets just trying to maximize the gains that they can make from this. And this carries the battle all the way through to Minsk and beyond. And then the final phase is where these advancing Soviet units are now beginning to reach the end of their logistic leash. They're also suffering very, very heavy losses at the same time that all of those German panzer divisions that have been shuffled off to North Ukraine are now returning and beginning to make their presence felt. So you have this series of actions, rather famously, 5th Panzer Division intercepts a radio signal from Rotmistrov's Guards Tank Army saying, if you bump into 5th Panzer Division, just go around them. Don't bother fighting them. You'll just get a bloody nose. There are gaps everywhere. Just, uh, following the Sun Tzu principle of be strong where your enemy is weak. By then, the German line is disintegrated to the point, you don't have to fight the Germans toe to toe. You can just outflank them and drive them back that way. But this last phase sees the panzer divisions effectively restoring the front line and cobbling together a new Eastern Front. And you have the new Volksgrenadier divisions turning up. You have police units that have been mobilized and herded together into ad hoc SS units, and they somehow managed to reconstruct a front line. Soviet losses during this are absolutely colossal. And there's a really interesting statistic here. So during the Battle of Normandy in the West, for every Western soldier killed, wounded, or missing, the Germans lose 2.2 men. The result of this is this catastrophic defeat in Normandy that costs Germany dear. During Bagration, for every German soldier killed, wounded, or missing, the Red Army loses 2.2 men, except the Germans still go down to a catastrophic defeat, which is a fascinating example of how the loss ratio that works so well against the Germans on one side doesn't work in their favor on the other side of Europe. And the scale of the Red Army is so great, they can soak up those losses, whereas the Germans really can't afford them by then.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And before we bring on people to ask comments, questions, Alex, of course, will jump in and just raise your little hands there, and we'll get to you. The last points I'd want to make before we start to bring on other people is your take in there, which you go into detail about the July plot and also the issue of the AK and Poland, because here you see the Cold War starting or underway, depends on how we interpret it. People could say the Cold War was underway earlier, of course, in the war. But this is quite dramatic when you have the clashes and the establishment of the Lublin government, the aftermath of all
Yes.
the acrimony between the government of exile and the Soviet Union, and then leading to, which I had forgotten, General Berling trying to relieve the fighters in Warsaw, and then gets relieved for launching an unauthorized attack. But those two questions, and Alex, please jump in with your comments, and everyone else, please raise your hands, and we'll get to you in order. But the July plot and the question of how you're viewing the fighting around Warsaw. Once I had an argument with this about David Glantz, and he basically said that the Soviets did not have the strength to move across and relieve them. So I said, well, wait, but politically they wanted to see the Germans kill the AK. So anyway, how do you see all this?
Norman Davis, who wrote Rising 44, which is one of the excellent accounts of the Warsaw Uprising, he starts the final section of his book with, I think, one of the most damning statements, where he says, in September, the last of the freedom fighters in Warsaw surrendered and laid down their weapons and marched into captivity, whilst less than half a mile away, the largest army in the world pretended it wasn't there. And I think that's a really brutal condemnation of the Red Army. I think David is right that the Red Army had reached the end of its leash when it comes to major operations. But look, they were on the east bank of the Vistula. They provided almost no artillery support. And that in that part of Europe, the Vistula is what? It's less than half a mile wide. Even if they just put a few tanks and anti-tank guns along the coast there, along the riverbank, they could have had quite a profound effect. They made no attempt to interfere with Luftwaffe operations over Warsaw. Um, any of you who have been to Warsaw, the Luftwaffe was largely operating from where the current Warsaw International Airport is. So it was very, very close to the city. The Stukas would take off, barely get up to dive bombing altitude before they would start their runs. At no point did Soviet aviation attempt to put those airfields out of action. You know, I'm not expecting the Red Army to fight its way forward through Warsaw. They could have done a great deal more, but it didn't suit their political objectives. For them to have Germans and pro-Western Poles killing each other was a great result. It served their purposes, and the fact that tens of thousands of civilians died in the process, from Stalin's point of view, was utterly irrelevant. It really didn't make any difference. Um, Enormous tensions between Poland and the Soviet Union leading up to the war, and that plays a big part in how things unfold. Um, my daughter and I have been writing an account of Warsaw during the Second World War, which we hope will be published late next year. It just depends on when Osprey get around to it. And we go into this in great detail, and you know, the the distrust, particularly on the Polish side, of anything to do with Russia and the Soviet Union that poisons everything leading up to the Second World War. It also affects profoundly how the Soviets react to the AK and to the Warsaw Uprising. The question of the July plot, my goodness, I just dived headlong into this rabbit hole um, and wandered around in it for ages and wrote thousands of words until I realized that it was not really relevant, however fun it was to be exploring this. But I think that I'm left with the impression that the plot would not have succeeded regardless of what happened. The bottom line is Hitler wasn't killed. Even if he had been killed, okay, what happens next? I am left with a very strong impression that Himmler knew full well that something was up. He wasn't there in Rastenburg when the attack went down. Um, the speed with which the Gestapo rolled up the German plotters and the number of people that they rounded up so swiftly tells its own story. They knew full well who the main suspects were, and yet they had allowed them to stay at large. And I think you can make a very plausible case for saying, you have Himmler sitting there thinking, well, it would be a terrible, terrible thing if the Fuhrer were to be killed. But how fortunate that I have my own private army and that I'm in a position to step in and take control of Germany. And I'm the sort of man that the West would be able to do a deal with. Utterly deluded, of course, but very much in keeping with the way he thought and the way his actions unfolded in the months that followed. Um, so I think that the best outcome for the plotters would have been that Germany would have disintegrated into chaos. There would have been fighting within Germany. And I think there would have been sufficient disruption, particularly in the West, to precipitate a very rapid collapse of German resistance. Now, what effect that would have had on the ultimate outcome of the war? Well, it's open to question, isn't it? Because at the very least, just like 1918 was poisoned by the growth of the stab in the back legend that poisoned German politics in the years that followed. Can you imagine the consequences of something like this in the late 1940s if there had been this disintegration? In a way, it's one of these things where you can only say it would have been a good thing in the knowledge of just how awful things were in reality. But of course, they didn't know that at the time, and they had no way of knowing the devastation that was going to take place in Germany in late 1944 and through 1945. And, had things gone differently, telling them, oh, it would have been, trust me, it would have been really awful, they'd have said, yeah, but it might not have been. It becomes an impossible argument to conduct. Um, but I think that was about the only, if you like, it's the last hope there is, A, of concerted and organized action to bring down the Nazi regime, and B, of giving Germany any possibility of a way out of this conflict before the utter destruction of 1945.
Hmm.
So it is the series of lost opportunities. I don't attempt to portray this as a possibility of a better government coming to power because let's face it, the plotters weren't exactly Democrats. They wanted to create a military dictatorship of their own. Um, and Stauffenberg and co. had absolutely no intention of handing back Polish territory or anything like that. They wanted um, the frontiers of late 1939 to be the future frontiers of Germany. Um, they were prepared to trade Alsace and Lorraine, but that was about the limit of their ambition on that. But I think there was a possibility of things becoming sufficiently chaotic for an awful lot of death to be avoided. Um, However, whether that would have then sowed the seeds for future conflicts, I guess we'll never know.
Right. We won't ever know. Go on, Alex. And Jay afterwards. Go on, Alex. You have to unmute Alex.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Prit, I just wonder again, kind of, I think about the same time your book come out, the Russian historian Boris Sokolov did came out with his own book, Operation Bagration and Complete Truth, and obviously he has access to you know the Russian archives, which you don't. He's also Russian speaker himself, and he comes on the big question of well, um, Hitler's responsibility, but also von Busch's responsibility for the collapse of the Germans. He comes to a very interesting and different conclusion than you, which is essentially to argue that not through any kind of genius, but that actually the decision to hold positions and even the kind of fortress Vitebsk and those kinds of actually wound up being the right decision. He actually argues that trying to do a mobile defense essentially would have collapsed the whole eastern, the northern part of the Eastern Front. And actually, he winds up arguing that essentially the Soviets were so set up with their mobile forces that they would have like hunted down and destroyed, Army Group Center, even worse. And actually, he argues basically by 44, they would have rolled up to the Otter and would have, ended the war quite a bit sooner, which obviously get very interesting. And, you can argue about that. But, he essentially argues that actually, again, any decision to retreat would have been even worse for, again, so I just wonder what you think of that, again, very different argument from, the one
Yeah.
you made about.
Yeah, we're into what ifs really, and this becomes a very difficult issue to argue about. I think it is. I think if Germany had been prepared to go into a more flexible and mobile defense, the front line by the end of 1944 might well have been pretty much the same, but the difference would have been that a large proportion of those 22 divisions would have been intact and still fighting. And the Germans would have been able to pull back, not entirely intact, but more intact than was actually the case. You know, but by the end of 1944, there are a couple of panzer operations which are of real interest here. Army Group North gets cut off, and the Germans mount Doppelkopf in an attempt to break through to Riga and re-link up with Army Group North. This fails despite the concentration of a very significant amount of German armor. At the same time, attempts to destroy Konyev's bridgehead over the Vistula at Sandomierz also fails despite the concentration of considerable armor. But at the same time, as Doug Nash has written, the forces operating to the east of Warsaw actually conduct a very effective counterattack against Soviet armor. What we're seeing here is the dying moments of the ability of the Panzer Arm to conduct offensive operations. The Red Army is getting pretty good at stopping panzer divisions in their tracks. The use of pack fronts, the use of small packets of tanks in mobile counterattacks, etc. They're getting quite good at this. But it's still a learning curve. And I think it's arguable that during the summer of 44, the Red Army wasn't there. And I think in a series of encounter battles across Belarus, the Germans would have had a considerable advantage. They would have blunted a lot of those attacks, which would at least have allowed those precious infantry divisions to pull back more or less intact. Even if they lost the equipment doesn't really matter so much because German industry is still producing copious quantities of guns, etc. But they would have brought back those experienced soldiers. And then you end up with 1945 and the Vistula Oder operation and the Red Army attacking veteran units rather than these scrambled together units. I don't think it is conceivable that the Red Army could have pushed all the way to the Oder in 1944. To go back to the analogy I started with, if you start from a start line running from New York to Richmond, Virginia, we're talking about a drive from that line all the way to the western parts of Minnesota if you're aiming to reach Berlin. Now, to do that in 5 months in the face of resistance from one of the most capable armies when it comes to encounter battles, it's optimistic. And I just don't see that happening. So yeah, they would probably have got to the Vistula anyway, but the Germans would have been in less bad shape for 1945. That's my view. But it's we just we'll never know, will we?
Yeah, and certainly again, of course, the Germans, especially after again, we have Leopold and others, always said, "Oh, if only Hitler had given us a few more Panzer divisions, well, either earlier on in Bagration, but or if we had 2 or 3 more Panzer divisions, well, either we would have stopped them cold, or obviously things would have been better." So I wonder what you think of that argument. Then we'll start to bring.
Yeah, perhaps show me where you're going to get those panzer divisions. It's not like there were heaps of armored units sitting around, reading the newspaper, watching the football or whatever. There was nothing available. Everything was tied up. You have Sixth Panzer Division, for example, gets sent off to Lithuania. It's only available because it was almost destroyed earlier in the year and has been undergoing reconstitution in Germany. And in fact, elements of 6th Panzer Division were held back in Lüneburg by members of the anti-Hitler conspiracy because they wanted to have units that they could call on. So there again, there's another overlap with one of the other themes. Yeah, it's one of these funny things, you get all the time, you get people like Manstein and Model saying, you know, I can only stabilize this if I have more troops. Well, they're in a position to know that there aren't more troops, that there just aren't, those troops are not available. At which point, in one of his books, Paul Hauser, the SS general, wrote about how ultimately one of the greatest responsibilities any senior commander has is to the men under his command. And there comes a time when you may have to disobey orders because of your responsibility to your men. And I think this is something that many, many German officers utterly failed, when they were put to that test. And they just stuck to, well, Befehl is Befehl. We have to follow orders. And their men paid a terrible, terrible price for that.
It's interesting you raise that. Hold on, Alex, just because I wanted to just mention the first time I met Paul Adair was at a conference in Germany in the 1980s. And that's where I met General Niepold. And Adair, I didn't realize his father had commanded the Guards Armored Division in World War II. That was a discovery that I made at that
Yeah.
event. But with Niepold was on the planning for Barbarossa as a young officer. And I remember asking them a question of how did your racist attitudes towards Slavs influence your operational thinking in attacking the Soviet Union? It was very funny. They started to argue in German. It was about a couple hundred people in the room. The Bundeswehr officers afterwards, I never was able to, after that, have to spend any money on booze for the rest of that conference because they were very happy I asked a question like that. But that was sort of interesting to just listen to that kind of reaction to it. And of course, at those events, they would not allow the SS to come because of internal politics in Germany. So that's another interesting sidebar to this. But Jay, go on, Jay.
Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to say thank you, Prit, for a terrific presentation and discussion. I can't think of a better way to spend a Sunday morning. My ears perked up a little bit ago when you were started to talk about the losses, the casualties on both sides during this operation. And I was wondering if you've ever had a chance to work out something like Dupuy's combat effectiveness value between the two sides. It sounded like you sort of were going in that direction. I don't think Dupuy had any battles in his original database that he used to develop his CEVs after Kursk. I don't think he had any of the late war Soviet battles. They were added later, but at that point, the formulas for CEV were pretty much calculated. So that's one question. And the other one is not really related, but working with Chris Lawrence back in the 90s on the Kursk database, having access to the Soviet archives for the brief window, one of the things that Chris sort of, I guess you could say, discovered and then mentioned frequently was the fact that Glantz only tended to use Russian sources in his writing and accepted them rather uncritically. And he ignored pretty much the German sources that were available. I don't know. I don't have an opinion one way or the other. I'm not an expert on the Eastern Front or anything, so I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
excellent questions. When it comes to force levels, I'm always slightly hesitant about, you know, tables of numbers of tanks and numbers of troops, etc., available, because one thing that those tables don't tell you is the quality of those troops. So, you can replace a tank, you can build a new tank. You can't replace um, a senior panzer commander who has, you know, 18 months, 2 years of field experience and know-how. And I think this is something that really hurts the Germans as the war goes on. Any army which has a tradition of leading from the front, you are losing those quality leaders at a disproportionate rate. And they're absolutely irreplaceable. You cannot bring up men from the lower levels at an adequate rate to replace those, particularly with the attrition levels on the Eastern Front. So these tables can be very useful, but I always ask people to remember that some of these reconstituted divisions, when it comes to their actual fighting power, even though they may have a full battalion of Panthers or whatever, actually how well those tanks can be used is, you know, perhaps a more complicated question. And also, boring logistics. Go back to that. If you can't provide fuel and again, here's an interesting thing. So even by late 1944, Panzer crews, German anti-tank gunners are complaining that the quality of the ammunition they're getting is poor. The tungsten content of armor-piercing rounds has fallen because there just isn't enough tungsten ore available. Rounds are breaking up on impact much more than they did before. Now, again, that's lost in these neat tables of numbers. So that's one point. When it comes to comparing Soviet and German accounts, okay, so shut me up if I go on a bit here because I think this is a huge subject in its own right. First of all, they recorded losses in a different way. So German after-action reports would record, we lost 5 tanks. What they meant was 5 tanks were left burning on the battlefield or were unrecoverable. They would also then say something like, by the end of the day, there were 10 tanks that were available in short time with after repairs, and another 10 that would require more substantial repairs. What the German accounts never record is what happens to those tanks. Because if the division is moving backwards quickly, a lot of those wrecks are going to be abandoned. So the total German losses are never what they're. If you just go by the after action reports of the Panzer divisions and you're looking at how many tanks they lost today, how many tanks they lost yesterday, the day before, that's actually an underestimate and a far more, if you look at the total tank production of Germany, if let's say in 1944, and then you look at how many tanks they had in the field at the beginning of the war, beginning of the year, and how many tanks they had in the field at the end of the year, and you add in the number that they built, that gives you a true idea of the tanks they've lost, and that is actually considerably greater than their recorded total loss. As I say, because of these abandoned tanks during the retreat. Soviet accounts, okay, here we go. Um, some of you will be familiar with Carius's book, Tigers in the Mud, and he describes this very detailed account of an action to the north of Vilnius, where with his Tiger company, he charges down the road into this village and engages some Soviet armor whilst the rest of the company's fanning out on either side of the village. And by the end of the day, they've knocked out X number of T-34s and Stalins. I've actually been there with a NATO group, and one of the US uh, one of the US tank commanders on the trip was saying he can see exactly what Carrius did and how he would have done it, because although you've got to thunder down this road and for about 2 minutes, the defenders get a pretty much a free shot at you. It's a free shot at the frontal armor of a Tiger. So, you're happy to take your chances on that. Interestingly, though, when I then relying on those glorious days when you could get into the Soviet archives, when I looked at the after-action reports of those tank brigades, there's absolutely no correlation between the tank losses that the Soviet commanders reported and Carrius's account. So, okay, one or both of these are fictional, and the answer probably is both. The Soviets, well, right the way back to the Russian Empire, one of the weaknesses of the Russian way of thinking, and this is still true today, is an absolute fear of speaking truth to power. You tell the boss what the boss wants to hear. So at the risk of digressing a little bit, I have a contact in Russia whose brother writes software for one of these quasi-independent Russian companies. It's owned by a Russian oligarch and they do a lot of work for the Russian government, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, his team was asked to produce a report on, back in about 2021, on how easily could the Ukrainian currency be absorbed into the Russian ruble. And this guy said that we wrote this report on the basis of every report we wrote in that era, which was, no one's ever going to read this. It's meaningless anyway. So we'll just spend a few weeks writing some rubbish and just send it in. And this is largely how you end up with that disastrous opening phase of the current Ukraine war. It was based on reports which had really no foundation in reality. You go back to the Imperial Russian era, and it was exactly the same. They told the Tsar what the Tsar wanted to hear, and we now have a modern Tsar, and nothing has really changed. So again, Russian accounts of losses are very variable in terms of quality. And I would be hesitant to rely blindly on either the German or the Soviet accounts. Final note on this, to make matters even worse, I have about a hard disk's full of scanned documents from the era when I could get into the Soviet archives. And of course, I can't anymore. But one of my contacts in Russia, because he has contacts in the academic community, can get into the Russian archives. And for obvious reasons, I can't say who he is because I don't want to get the guy into trouble. But he recently sent me some documents, which by chance I happened to have already. I was horrified to see that they are different. The current Russian government is falsifying the historical record. The Soviet Union also did that at great length. So, for example, during the 1990s and 2000s, most of the accounts of the Katyn massacres were destroyed. The detailed lists of who had been shot were destroyed. But in the wonderfully inept manner that bureaucracies work, they didn't destroy the records of the cover-up. So there are detailed reports written in about 1998 from this guy to Moscow saying, I have destroyed the records of the execution of 21,232 Polish prisoners. Just, for a historian, this is great stuff, but it just shows you how records get falsified all the time, and sometimes interpreting them can be an absolute nightmare.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are great points. And Jay raises a really interesting question. We'll have to have David here to talk about this because I'm not going to answer for him. I've certainly read and seen him do his work. The one point that Jay raises in his discussion that is interesting, some of us around here have been associated with national security education at the university level for decades. And when it comes to conventional war, they stink because they generally base their analysis on number crunching, on essentially no attention to the dynamics of battle. And hence you get produced out of these programs people who will be serving eventually in the intelligence agencies or the DoD or even as active officers, people with knowledge of how you look at military balances or how you look at actual war itself based on simply pure structural analysis. And I don't think any of us here would disagree that that is not the way to look at actual conflict. The friction of war throws everything out the door. Michael, go on, Michael.
Yes, great talk. I have a few questions actually. One of which is, does the problems with the recording of the German recording of the tank losses, does that also apply to personnel, especially in light of the fact that, excuse me, German sources tend to lie, not only actually on the Eastern Front, but in their recounting of the Western Front. But so I was wondering if that applied to personnel as well. Also, the idea of the because you mentioned that 70% of the resources still had to go to the Eastern Front. But then again, I mean, is that total resources? Because obviously, you have the Navy, which was devoted to the West, obviously, and the better part, and I say the higher quality part of the Air Force. Does that take into account quality of the resources? Because actually, the Western allies were hoping that Bagration would denude the German defenses on the Western Front, and the Soviets were hoping that D-Day and Normandy would denude the German defenses on the Eastern Front. So did the quality of those resources, how would that add up into that? And again, I know when we're dealing with the percentage of resources, we're also dealing with statistical analysis, which is problematic also. But I was wondering what your thoughts are with that. And the first question has to do with personnel losses, as far as the German accounts of their personnel losses as well as their armor loss.
Let's do those in turn then. So the personnel loss question is really interesting. There is often a very poor correlation between the ration strength of formations when you attempt to correlate that with their recorded losses. So which one do you believe? Well, I tend to believe, I'm boring on this, I tend to believe the logisticians. So basically, if you need this many rations, that's probably how many men there are there. Both the Soviets and the Germans sometimes lied about their losses purely in order to get more supplies. If you claim to have more men, you're going to get more supplies. That's kind of a two-edged weapon, though, because the Führer is also likely to tell you to hold a larger length of front because you're claiming you have more men. But on the other hand, he's going to tell you to hold that front line regardless of how many men you have, because Hitler continued to say, okay, a battalion can hold this much front line, and he made absolutely no allowances for the fact that the battalion was at half strength or whatever. So in that case, yeah, you effectively have a license to lie about your numbers because you'll get a bit more ammunition, you'll get a bit more food, etc. I imagine there were dozens of reasons why people on both sides, faked their statistics on this, and also faked the statistics on the losses they're inflicting on the other side. And you get little insights into this. I found a memoir of a Soviet anti-tank gunner of how during one action they killed a tiger, and it took five anti-tank guns and a Lend-Lease Sherman to do the job. But they were so delighted at how it unfolded that each of those anti-tank guns and the Sherman were awarded a kill. So you can see how this just distorts the figures completely. I don't know the full details of how the Germans accounted for their manpower casualties, because it's a much more complex picture than, like I say, how they recorded their armored losses. I imagine there are other people who'd be able to speak with much more clarity on that than me. But it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that yeah, there are all sorts of miscorrelations on that. Then the other question, sorry, remind me, was?
What was about the what percentage, and analyzing what
Ah,
percentage of
right,
resources to which
right,
side
right, right,
and the
right.
quality. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, this is really interesting, and this does show that actually the expectations of both sides, that the of both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, that the other side's efforts would help their own efforts. These expectations actually came true. They may have been disappointed to the level to which it helped them, but it undoubtedly did help them. So from the Soviet side, the Luftwaffe's fighter effort was now largely in the West in an attempt to keep the Allied bomber offensive at bay, with varying degrees of success or failure. But that meant that Soviet aviation was able to operate much more freely. And moreover, German fighters weren't able to control large areas of the eastern skies as they had until then. However, it's worth bearing in mind that right the way through to the closing phases of the war, the nature of the Eastern Front was such that for very short periods, the Germans could achieve local air superiority in order to allow them to continue to operate these obsolescent Stukas and Heinkels, etc. So it's a complicated picture, but depleting the fighter units on the Eastern Front had a profound effect on the ability of Soviet aviation to function, and also the Germans to carry out, for example, reconnaissance flights. Almost impossible if there are yaks hanging around ready to jump you at any time. Um, the When I say 70%, I guess I'm really talking about ground forces in terms of the panzer divisions, the amount of artillery, the amount of munitions being shifted, etc. The naval side is really interesting because the fans of naval gunfire support really need to look at the operations of Prince Eugen and Admiral Scheer in the Baltic in 1944 and the immense effect they had. Later on this month, I'm taking a NATO group to Tukums on the coast near Riga, where Prince Eugen's guns smashed an entire regiment of Joseph Stalin's. And these two ships repeatedly gave gunfire support all the way through to the very end of the war. I think Scheer actually burnt out her barrels, the rifling in her barrels. By the end, Prince Eugen was out of ammunition, but her very presence off the coast was enough to make the Soviets back off, because they had learned to fear the reach of her guns and the accuracy of her guns. Yeah, and the Germans were still obsessed with this notion of we have to control the Baltic so that we can train the future crews of the new U-boats that are being built, etc. And it was one of the reasons why Hitler was so reluctant to give up the Baltic states.
Yes, thank you, Michael. And it's really interesting. John McGill brought up Jonathan Dimbley's book Endgame, which of course is really, really interesting in terms of its look at this same subject. And when you talk about this, I'm reminded about, I read your book, Alex and I have worked on this Bagration as a project for quite a long time. And it's one of these things where the more you know, the less you know. Because the level of detail that we need to know to get a better sense tactically of what's going on in these pursuit operations, for example, et cetera, is just very hard to construct at this point in
Yes.
time. Almost impossible. And the other issue that you raise about the question of distortion of history, well, we know, of course, it happens in the West, in the United States. My great example all the time is Roy Appleman's volume of the defeat in 1950 in Korea, which was essentially suppressed by the U.S. Army, and he was forced to publish that afterwards in a university press, but because it was too embarrassing for those that were experiencing that. And we see, of course, what's going on right now, this is my opinion, of course, with the suppression of historical complexity at national park sites. It's always bad to mess with the complexities of history, because then people get caught up in thinking which excludes dissonant information, if you will. Mark, go on, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. My question regards, you mentioned the logistics and the importance of logistics. To what extent Do we owe or do the Soviets owe their victory in Bagration to the thousands or tens of thousands of American trucks, just simple
Yeah,
trucks?
yeah. I was asked this at a conference in New Orleans in November. Um, to an American audience, the diplomatic answer was to say that it was absolutely critical and vital, because that's what the guy who had asked the question wanted me to say, which was I was very happy to say because it was absolutely vital and critical. Would the Soviets have been able to do this without that? I think the answer is yes, but nowhere near as effectively. Um, and I think the depth of the advance would have been much less. It's not just the trucks; it's the enormous amount um, of stuff, of fuel, of ammunition, of food, and everything else, of medical equipment. All of that stockpiled right behind the front line, ready to roll. Even at this stage, the Red Army is very dependent on railways to move bulky equipment. Let's face it, the
Still
Russians
is.
still are. And the Germans are systematically destroying railways as they pull back. It's not just blowing up bridges, they're tearing up the rails, they're ripping up the sleepers, they're demolishing railway cuttings and embankments, etc. So until you restore that, you are dependent upon gasoline and trucks. So those trucks are absolutely vital. And although the Soviets were producing trucks nowhere near the number that they were given by the United States, by Canada, and by Britain. So yeah, they played an enormously important part. And and it's not just me being polite to an American audience saying, yeah, they were critical. They were absolutely vital. They allowed what would probably have been a successful operation to be turned into a dazzlingly successful operation. Let's put it that way. They allowed the Soviets to sustain the operation in a way that would have been inconceivable in any other circumstance.
Yeah, and on top of that, you could pile on also all the spam, the leather boots,
Absolutely. Yeah.
the copper wire, the radios,
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
that don't fit well into a statistical,
Yeah.
analysis of the battle.
Yeah, absolutely. And those of us who have spent time in uniform will know the absolutely incalculable value of being well fed. And if you're not being fed well, um, just sustaining high tempo operations becomes much harder. Morale suffers. Um, and again, this is one of these imponderable factors that how do you keep people going, and the ability of armies to get food, get supplies, get new boots and get the replacement uniforms to the front line is really, really important.
Thank you.
Yes, very important. And anyone else, Ivan, Joe, Owen, John, Chris, you have any comments or questions, please raise your hand. It raises very interesting questions here. And I should let you know, we've actually been digitizing David Glantz's maps. So I should send you what we've got because I think, seriously, he has literally 9,000 maps.
He has the most incredible collection of maps. And um, it's one of my greatest regrets that I've never met David because
Well, we could figure that. We could probably do that. We could figure something out.
because because he is an absolute gentleman. He is the kindest fellow researcher you can imagine, and he gives information, copies of maps, data to anybody who takes the trouble to ask him. Um, just a just an absolute star, one of my real heroes. And without him, I would not have been able to travel the road that I've traveled.
Right. And with us, with this particular audience, you don't have to be shy about saying things to us about America. Trust me. And David, of course, David actually donated his books to be published for free in Russia, which is one of it's quite amazing. The stuff he's done. And as I say, he's has to take care of a loved one right now, so he's out of action.
Yes.
Michael, yeah, go on, Prit. What are you going to say?
No, I was just going to say the donation of books for free to Russia, I'm less enthusiastic about because Russians have used that as a stick with which to beat me, saying, "Well, if David can give us his books for free, why can't you?"
Right. Well, David, of course, was basically, subsidized by the U.S. Army. But anyway, Michael, go on, Mike.
Yes, actually, I had this question before, but I didn't want to seem piggish when I was asking you. Um, the um, the question I had was about the Allied bombings of German industry, uh, and to what effect? Because you mentioned the horses, and obviously the Germans couldn't totally mechanize their army, even though they apparently intended to anytime during the war. But also, as far as the ammunition, they had by the end of the war, 1 out of every 4 cartridges from a MG42 was made out of wood. This kind of, to what effect do you believe the bombings of Germany had on the German industry had on this on the Soviet offensive in this particular case?
And before you answer that, Britt, I wanted to add something on the horses. Michael Howard once in a seminar at Yale talked about when he is in northern Italy at the end of the war, he's literally seen herds of horses released, of German horses that had been captured. They're just running rampant, sort of like Mustangs in the West, as something he remembered as a young junior officer. But go on. I know that doesn't have to do with the bombing offensive, but I wanted to throw that horse issue
Yeah,
in.
yeah. Okay, it's a difficult question because, of course, the whole strategic bombing offensive has become such a controversial subject. And, even if it was effective, was the mass killing of so many German civilians justifiable in order to achieve that? Yeah, you can argue that depending on your point of view on this. What effect did it have? Well, German armaments production peaks in the autumn of 1944. And at this point, the RAF and the US Army Air Force has been flattening German cities for some considerable time. Um, Speer's memoirs on this are really interesting because he talks about how the attempt to destroy the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt were actually very effective, but the losses suffered by the USAAF was such that they didn't repeat it. And he says, had they done so, that would have been very awkward. But he also makes the point that the Germans changed their designs to make them less reliant upon those components. The real thing that hurts by the end of 1944 is actually raw material shortages. So you're running out of wolfram, which is the ore that you make tungsten from. You're running out of cobalt and nickel and molybdenum, etc., to make the various high-tech steels that you need. You're also running out of brass, which is why you end up with steel cartridges. And steel, of course, has a very different expansion coefficient from brass. So guns jam because the damn things expand and block the breech. It's not only losing access to raw materials, it's losing the ability to move them. And the devastation of railways. Okay, yeah, you can replace railway lines, and the Germans have become very good at repairing their railway lines, and the Reichsbahn continues to function right to the very end of the war. But the sheer loss of rolling stock starts to have an effect. I think one of the biggest effects of the bomber offensive is something we've touched on already, which is the massive diversion of Luftwaffe fighter resources to defend the German cities, and sucking those fighters into a battle which ultimately they're going to lose. And how there is that phase of the bomber offensive where in the run-up to D-Day, it is almost being conducted as an exercise to bring the German fighter arm to battle so that they can erode it sufficiently to guarantee air supremacy over Western Europe. And I think, again, this something we've touched on before. The loss of those experienced air crews is very important too. Even if you can replace those aircraft, you're losing experienced fighter pilots. And anybody who has been around aircraft, etc., will know just how long it takes to skill up people in aerial warfare. So I think the impacts of the bomber offensive were multiple. Which were more important than others? I guess it depends on your personal point of view and yeah, the axe you want to grind on this. And I think there are probably people who are far more qualified than me to talk about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, the question of bombing. I mean, look at how we're reacting to what's going on in the Middle East right now. Uh, and and your thoroughness, of course, is quite impressive. It'd be too bad you weren't still a GP because we could use you here in the United States, Prit. In any event, the issue of the strategic bombing is a very interesting one, Michael, because I remember when I had the privilege of reading through the strategic bombing reports. And so I've always rejected the argument that they didn't have an effect, because they did have an effect. It was essentially a second front being waged against Germany. Not of the scale that Stalin wanted, of course, but nevertheless, it did have that effect. And they did indeed disrupt the industries inside Germany. But that will be an issue they debate forever. Go on, Alex.
Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, well, first question. Yeah, I want to kind of get into more detail on Soviet air operations. Because again, Jim and I have been looking at the New York Public Library, and again, there have been a bunch of Russian books that have come out since 2000 on, and they will show photos again. So this clearly happened of like a devastated German column of armor that was shot up by a bunch of I don't know Sturmovik or just Soviet air. So I just wonder, yeah, what you were able to find in terms of obviously the Soviet air, and then there's also Christer Bergstrom's book that he did, from Bagration. I think it comes from Bagration to Berlin that follows Soviet air operations last year at the war, and again he talks about the effectiveness. But again, what were you able to find again in terms of how good they're getting, and again just the effect it had on the German army? Obviously, nothing like again effect of American and British air in Normandy on the British, which again we know was very.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're getting better, and they're obviously having an effect. So I just wonder what
Let me interject something on that. I did mention that we discovered that book that had those photos to David. I said, and David said he'd never seen pictures of columns of German troops destroyed like that by the Red Air Force, which gets into the question of how the issue we've been talking about all the time about how the problem of how you rely on the Soviet sources and understanding what goes on. But yeah, please, Fred.
So let me start at the end there and say that's probably an exception rather than the rule. Now, I was a grunt, I was a ground soldier. My father was an Air Force officer. When it comes to believe, who do I believe? A pilot flying over a battlefield at 300 miles an hour, or the guy sitting in the slit trench on the ground? You can guess where my allegiance lies on this. There's an account I found of the Sturmoviks operating outside Stalingrad in late 1942. And it gives the account of them finding this German column in the snow, attacking it, leaving vehicles burning, Germans scattering into the snow. Great job. 17th Panzer Division's diary records being held up by snow, occasional air attacks, no casualties. So, okay, you'd believe who you want to believe. It's not just the Eastern Front, it's the Western Front, it's the Korean War, it's the Vietnam War, it's the Gulf War. The efficacy of air power is often, shall we say, overstated by air crews. Unless you're actually on the ground to count wrecks and to count bodies, you don't really know how effective it really was. So yes, a picture of a destroyed German column would be very compelling evidence. But it's only one photo. It's not as if we have loads and loads of those photos. Those extraordinary photos from the Highway of Death north of Kuwait, where US air had absolutely smashed the Iraqi columns as they were retreating. Yeah, very, very compelling evidence. But the corollary of that is Those were Iraqi units pulling back that had been under constant air attack for several weeks beforehand, and yet they still had all of that kit, despite all the claims of a number of vehicles destroyed. How effective were these operations? Well, the Sturmovik proved to be an utter disaster when it was deployed in Korea. They just took very heavy losses. They had very, very little effect on the battlefield. Germans hated the Sturmovik. Largely because it was invulnerable, not because it did them enormous damage, but because they just couldn't get anything back against them because of the armor of the plane. The plane they really, really hated was that ridiculous little biplane, the PO2, that used to fly over at night and wake them up. Because again, it was just so massively disruptive. You just didn't get any sleep because the bastard would glide in and drop grenades into your trench. Yeah, I remember reading about RAF Typhoons firing those salvos of rockets from their rocket launchers under the wings. Um, they they did some tests, I think, on a Panther parked in the middle of a field in France, and they found that 1 in 20 rockets actually hit it. And this is without any ground fire coming up at you, a perfect approach, no interference, whatever, a stationary target. And yet these reports are full of, oh, we killed all of these tanks, we did this, we did that. I just don't believe it. I just don't see that being that effective. Soft skin vehicles, maybe. Actually killing armor, highly unlikely. I don't see that as such a thing. But again, boring logistics. You kill the soft skin vehicles, it's just as effective as at paralyzing operations. And it'll very, very much disrupt operations. The Soviets never really had the equivalent of forward air controllers that the Germans had from the very outset, and the US and the Brits adopted very, very quickly. Their air operations tended to be much like the use of artillery, that it was a preordained plan. This is what you're going to do. And okay, they would unleash some fighter bombers just on roaming operations to go and hunt stuff and kill stuff. But pretty much every memoir I've found has been more about we were told to target this railway yard, or we were told to hit this objective, and that's what we did. Whereas, the Brits and Americans would be flying wings of aircraft just waiting for ground controllers to call them in on a strike. And of course, FLIFO was operating with Stukas, did that all the way through the war.
Right. And yeah, similar question about, I mean, obviously there's a lot of romanticism, from the Russians about the partisans. And, but it is clear that it had some effect on, especially again, there's this huge partisan force that's in. And again, obviously, again, I think the Soviets exaggerated, because they're like, oh, essentially kind of almost arguing, oh, we knocked out the German logistics for a few days. But I just wonder what you think in general in terms
Yeah.
of
Well, I think I'm going to have to make this a last question because I'm meant to be cooking dinner right now. So I'm going to have to cut and run, otherwise I'll be in big trouble. It's a fascinating question, and it's all wrapped up in Soviet historiography. You think about this from the Soviet point of view. The partisan war is the epitome of the Soviet people fighting the hated fascists under the leadership of the Communist Party. It just fits that whole historiography so well. So of course they're going to make the most of this. How effective was it? Well, they blew up a lot of trains, they blew up a lot of railway lines. I think it's a little bit like the bomber offensive. One of its most efficacious things is the number of German troops it ties down. So every train now has to have troops guarding it. You have entire divisions pulled out of the front line for anti-partisan sweeps, which degenerate into exercises in mass murder. They report on this operation, we killed 12,500 partisans. We recovered 350 weapons. Well, that kind of tells you the number of partisans they actually killed, and the rest were just innocent bystanders. There are, but it became the stuff of legend because of the way that Soviet historiography developed, and undoubtedly it was exaggerated. But there is no question that it pulled German forces out of the front line, where they would have been more usefully employed in order to carry out these these sweeps. And I think to use a phrase from one of George MacDonald Fraser's books, this is a little bit like weeding your garden in a wet summer. You achieve a temporary success, and guess what? Tomorrow the weeds are growing again. And German policy could have been deliberately designed to encourage civilians to take up arms against you. Utter madness, really.
All right. Well, listen, I want to thank you. Prit Buttar is the author of Bagration 1944, published by Osprey Books. And as you can see, Prit, we could have you on for quite a long time talking about these.
I would love to come back.
I would interrupt you making dinner, believe me.
I'd love to come back sometime.
Yes, yes. Of course, we'd love it. And your next book is going to be on what?
So Into the Reich is published early next year. This is the Vistula Oder operation. So this is the Red Army sweeping across Poland, the liberation of Auschwitz, the death marches, etc., and the failure of Sonnenwende outside to the east of the Oder. Endgame Berlin is now in design, and that should come out hopefully sometime next year. And this is the Battle of Berlin, which was a fascinating thing to research. And then my daughter and I have now started this new project. Osprey have commissioned us to write a series of books entitled Cities at War. The first is Warsaw. The second, which we are just beginning to collect material on, will be Paris. And then we hope to go on to Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Rome, who knows, Manila. We'll see where our reading takes us.
Well, you go to Shanghai. I mean, it's a great. But one thing I'd like to suggest to you is it'd be fun to take your other books and do the same thing we're doing right now with them. And we would love to do that with you because
that'd be fascinating.
We could actually, and then I'll get David. I'll round him up since his name was invoked by Jay, and I'll make sure that he participates because I'm sure he'd look forward to meeting you too. Joe, did you want to say something?
No. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Prit. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody,
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.